We're here to talk about the future of CSS, but if we want to know where we're going, we have to understand where we are and how we got here. And in my mind, CSS exists for two primary reasons. First, to make styles responsive, and not just responsive to the dimensions of the viewport, but also to user preferences and device interfaces. When Sir Tim and the team at CERN first released the Hypermedia browser, it was designed for the Next machine, which has this fancy graphic interface, but you can't make a web that's worldwide by saying it works on my machine and everyone else is an edge case. So right away, they released a second browser. And this one was designed to work on any terminal with an internet connection. You didn't even need to download the browser. You just SSH or log into the CERN servers, and you could just use the browser from there. That's not SSH, that's longer ago. And this ends up becoming the mission statement of the web, web for all, web on everything. It has to work everywhere, and that includes assistive devices and non-visual media. Right from the beginning, this was part of the plan, always with the end user in control of the outcome. The user should have control over absolutely everything that we do. So we provide hints and suggestions, semantic clues, but only the browser can put all of that information together because only the browser knows all the constraints. So the cascade describes that process by accepting style sheets from everyone involved in the system, literally a cascade of style sheets. Browsers and users establish global defaults and preferences that apply across the web, and then we fill in the details, the branding for our particular site. So these are the primary cascade origins. Each one represents sort of a different set of needs and concerns in the system, author, user, and user agent. But these different perspectives can sometimes be in conflict. So the rules of the cascade and inheritance describe how we merge all three of these origins and resolve those conflicts. And in most cases, the user preferences get to override browser defaults. So the browser goes first, sets some defaults, users come along and are able to override some of those with their preferences. And for better or worse, we're allowed to come along and blow it all out of the water, do whatever we want. But when things get really heated, when it really matters, the user and browser can insist that some styles are more important than others. And that creates important origins with the cascade in reverse order. Important author styles aren't that special. We're just right there in the middle. Our styles, we add important and they bump up slightly in the cascade. But when the user or user agent adds important styles, they take control back over from us. So we sort of flip that dynamic of power. The second goal of CSS is to make our designs objects reusable. Instead of repeating the same styles over and over in our HTML, we can use selectors to apply styles broadly, creating patterns based on things like classes and attributes, and then combining those to compose entire reusable objects and layouts, design systems, and component libraries. So CSS is object-oriented at its core, but it's also declarative, contextual, resilient features of the cascade. The CSS is cascade-oriented. It's sort of its own unique thing. But these selectors create another potential conflict that the cascade has to resolve. Since we can use multiple selectors to target the same element, the cascade needs to determine which one wins. So it uses a clever heuristic, basically an educated guess to figure that out. And we call that specificity. We assume for this guess that each selector type is meant to represent a different goal or perspective in the system based on how narrowly that selector is targeted. So the most generic selectors help us paint in really broad strokes, establish low priority defaults, and then we can build on top of that with classes and attributes to describe higher priority patterns that make up the majority of our styles. And then one-off IDs are the most narrowly targeted and also the highest priority. And then inline styles even above that, though those aren't selectors. And we can combine all these various ways. We can put IDs and classes together, but the specificity is always handled in layers. If you have any IDs, it will always beat any selector that has no IDs. So we can just look at the first category, and if IDs are equal, that's the only time we need to look at how many classes or attributes there are. So these are solid layers. You can't move from one to the other. You can't have enough classes and attributes to beat an ID. So this whole system is a rough approximation of the layers in our code, moving from global abstractions to more narrowly targeted components and overrides. But it's not a perfect system. It's a good guess, and that's all it can be. And especially at scale, our projects get more complex, and we've got distributed teams, third-party integrations, and there's a lot of situations that don't quite fit that heuristic. Some low priority defaults are very specific. This is from the browser styles for Firefox. And some really generic attributes actually should have more weight behind them. We expect the hidden attribute to be powerful. And of all of these selector layers, there's only one layer where we have control over creating them, defining them, and also reusing them however we want to. So we end up sort of arguing over how many classes and attributes we're allowed to have in a selector, with strict rules and conventions to ensure that the cascade specificity matches exactly what we're trying to do to create these perfectly crafted layers of intent. And then somebody throws in importance like a hand grenade. Or one part of the system doesn't agree on how you're going to do it because you're using third-party tools or you have a distributed team and you're not synced up on the conventions. So this brings us to the first feature that I want to talk about, which is cascade layers. Cascade layers would allow us to create our own custom layers of the cascade that more explicitly represent these parts of the system, potentially from different teams, potentially third-party code. We can think of them sort of as customized layers of specificity, or very much like the CSS origins. They're designed after the origins, but they're within an origin. We get to create them for things like resets, defaults, frameworks, themes, component libraries, utilities, anything we want. We can layer the cascade based on the system that we have in whatever order we need. And then like origins, the important flag works the way it was designed. So it inverts the layers when it becomes necessary for a lower layer to punch above its weight and say, this may be a default, but it's a very important default. So for syntax, we can define these layers either by adding a layer function to an import rule, or we can use the @layer rule to create blocks of code inside of layers, nested inside. Or we can do both. Here we're creating a default layer with the headings.css file, and then we're using the @rule to add more styles into that same default layer. So once we've established a layer, we can add more things into it. And layers stack in the order they're first defined. So the first time that we encounter the name of a layer, that's where the layer is in the stack. The first layer is at the bottom and the last layer is at the top. And the highest layer will always win selector conflicts, no matter what specificity is used for those selectors. So specificity only matters inside of a layer, and then layers override each other. So this single menu item class in the override layer will override the combined menu drop-down item classes that are part of the framework layer. This makes it simple for us to, say, pull in third-party code and say exactly where it should fit in our system and how we want to override it, no matter how they've established their selectors. But we don't need to keep our styles in that same order all the time. Once a layer's been established, we can add to it from anywhere in our code. And the priority is always based on the first appearance of the name. So default is still the lowest layer, but we can add to it again as we like. We can even use the @layer rule without any styles, just a name to establish that order up front. And then once we've established the order, we can work on our code in any order we want. This seems especially useful for a lot of CSS and JS libraries load styles in sort of arbitrary orders. So if you say what layer they should be part of, you can help with a little bit of the problems that come from that. And there's a shorthand syntax to make it even easier when you want to just establish layer order for several layers at once. You can do that at the top of the document, and then won't be surprised no matter what layers load in what order. One of the goals here is to make sure that authors get to define exactly where third-party tools fit. No matter what specificity those tools use internally, we can always override them or fit in under them as we want. And it also gives tool builders, component library authors, the ability to provide layers, to say, my tool actually comes in 6 layers, and you can either wrap them all up into a sub-layer, which can be combined with these dot delimited namespaces, tools.theme, tools.custom. Or we can also create and access nested layers by actually nesting layer rules. So tools.custom and layer tools, layer custom, those mean the same thing. So it gives us a lot more control over our corner of the cascade, the bit we get to influence. So we're not totally reliant on selector specificity or code source order to determine what takes precedence in our code. We have control over the cascade and get to define it for ourselves. And hopefully this allows us to replace a lot of specificity hacks and importance and just set up the systems the way that we want them. Of course, we don't want to put all of our styles into layers, especially probably right away, because older browsers won't be able to see what's in a layer. So we want to make sure that there's a path forward to slowly start adding layers. So much like mobile first design or something like that, we're making the default styles the lowest layer, and then you can build things on top of those default styles as a progressive enhancement. The layers will add on top of unlayered styles. This is actually a recent change. We initially had it the other way around in the spec, and we flipped it recently to try to get that behavior. So it would work better for progressive enhancement. There's also some discussion of making it adjustable, so you can decide where your default styles go in the layer stack. That's an open conversation, but feel free to join the conversation if you're interested. So the next feature that I want to talk about, there are these slight breaks between 3 different main topics. So if people have questions on that last one, we can stop here and chat about it briefly.
I think there's one question from Leonard. Leonard, do you want to ask it yourself? No. So the question is, how would you insert these rules dynamically via JavaScript? So would you use it the standard way, or is there like an individual approach?
Because normally you rely on cascading, and now the position of where the layer is defined is getting more important. So I can see some nefarious code want to be the latest in the layer definitions, or the first in the layer definitions.
Yeah, I mean, to take precedence, it would have to be the last. The goal is that since you can establish upfront the order that you want layers to stack in.
Mm-hmm.
If there's nefarious code anywhere, you have the ability to say, wrap it up in this other layer that I've already positioned. So you can turn it into a sublayer, and that gives you control over where you're positioning it, even if it's coming from somewhere else. We don't have a specific JavaScript API designed for this at this point. I don't really have a concept of what that would look like, but you could open an issue and the working group would absolutely look at it.
And also had a secondary question. Normally via CSS, you can look if something is supported. Is at layers also going to be looked at that way?
So we would need, so it will act as its own true case of support, right? So anything you put inside of it will only happen if it's true. For the negative case, we would need a new function on the supports rule. We would need @supports and then a function for layer. So you could say not layers. I will open an issue about that. That's a.
I was just wondering how progressive enhancement gonna work with layers then, and how can you check that?
Yeah, the idea is that initially you'll have to use it for progressive enhancements that will only appear on the newer. And basically, if you take that mobile first approach, where you have styles that work unlayered and then slowly start adding enhancements on top of that for newer browsers.
Yeah. That answers my question. Thank you.
Yeah,
great. Josh also had a question that is picking up the discussion a little bit. Can you assign a layer to the link element, or is this planned?
We hope so. That because that's HTML, that has to go through a slightly different process. So that's not something that the CSS working group could decide unanimously. But we do have an issue open for that and are hoping that will be possible.
All right. Then I think that's it for the moment. If there are still more questions, I will collect them for later, or we will collect them.
So scoped styles are also about how selectors work. With scope, we're trying to address two issues that come up regularly and often are what drive people to use tools like BEM or CSS in JS. And the first of those is to avoid naming conflicts as our projects grow. But we often do that by focusing on the second goal, which is expressing membership or ownership in our selectors somehow. And while we have nesting for selectors, it doesn't quite express what we want. In this case, a title inside of a post, we can say that, but that's not quite the same thing as a post title. The first one describes any title anywhere inside of the post. And the second describes just the title of the post, the one that belongs to that pattern, not any that happen to be inside of it. And that's an important distinction. So we don't really have a good way to describe that in CSS currently, unless we turn to either manually creating custom selectors every time, or we rely on some JavaScript preprocessor to compile that unique class for us. And if we want global styles, we end up with multiple classes, some way to target it multiple times, and we hope that they're always going to override in the right order. So another way to think about this is that a lot of components have holes in the middle. There's a donut of scope. So the post has a title, but it also has contents that could have other titles. The contents are sort of outside the donut, or there's tabs or media objects that have a pattern and then take arbitrary content in the middle. So this idea of donut scope, where some things inside don't belong to the pattern, is what we're trying to express. And this might sound a little bit like Shadow DOM, and there's definitely crossover here between what I mean by scope and how Shadow DOM encapsulation approaches this similar ideas. But the Shadow DOM is designed around highly isolated widgets. The boundaries are defined in the DOM, in the HTML, so that each element has a single scope, and styles are isolated from getting in or out of that element. Scopes never overlap at all. And I'm interested in what more of these tools have done, CSS modules, Vue, to create a type of scope that's a little bit more fluid and flexible than that. It's a lot lighter touch and more CSS-y in ability to cross over and still have global styles. So scopes reference the DOM, but they're more fluid, they can overlap, they integrate more smoothly with global design systems. Different scopes can have different boundaries, and global styles can continue to apply straight through. So we can define the scope of every style rather than defining the scope of an element. This gives us a much lower impact alternative to something like Shadow DOM that can be defined entirely in CSS and then reused across components as we want. So what I'm proposing is a scope rule that accepts both a scope root selector and also a lower boundary selector. So you can say from something to something in the tree, I only want to select between those in that donut. And then any selectors inside the at rule only apply within that donut of scope. In this case, we're styling images inside of media unless they are also inside of the media content. So we're only selecting the media image. We can also talk about this in terms of proximity. These two selectors, light theme A and dark theme A, we're styling links inside of our different themes. That's great until we start nesting those themes, and then it falls apart because whichever one we define second overrides the one we defined first, no matter which theme is closer to the link we're styling. Proximity doesn't matter in CSS currently, so we get the dark theme styles even if we switch back to light theme. So we can solve that problem using lower boundaries if we want to, so that the themes never actually bleed into each other. We could just say that every theme ends at the next theme. But I also think it might make sense for proximity to have some power in the cascade when we're setting scopes, so that when everything else is equal, when the selectors have the same specificity, they're in the same layer, then proximity comes into play before we look at source order as the final fallback. So that's my proposal. This one is, there's not a spec written yet. It's a little bit more theoretical at this point. Lots of people are interested in scope, but everybody means something slightly different when they use the word scope. So there's like 50 different meanings of the term out there. And it's going to take some negotiation to get this through, but there's definitely been interest from the working group. So we're pushing forward on this slowly. Any thoughts on that one before I move on to the star of the show?
I think Leonard is
I do have a question. So in your proposal, could there be like, would it apply to more than one hole? So if I have nested like 3 holes, so it would always be the same.
It would.
And after it closes, it will apply the scopes rules again. So let's say I have a title, then I have the hole, and then I have another title and another hole.
Yeah, if the scoped selector is used various places on the page, if that scope exists various places on the page, it would apply to all of them. Yeah, does that answer the question?
I think so, yeah.
We have two more from Leonard.
Okay.
In the definition, you have the beginning of the donut and the end of a donut.
Mhm.
But what if there is no end to a donut? Does it
Yeah,
still get used, or?
You can leave that off. So you can do scopes just from a root and everything inside of them. Or are you asking if the end of the donut doesn't exist
First,
in the HTML?
you define the query from the beginning of a donut to the end of the donut. But if there's no end to the donut, then does it still get applied?
It does still get applied.
Yeah.
So it gets applied until it sees that end.
Check.
So if it never runs into it, it is still applied.
Yeah. And can you have nested scopes?
Yes. Wait. I'm not sure what it would mean.
No, for example, if you have an example on the screen now, if you have data theme multiple times in the HTML tree, what would it do?
Yes. Right. So, right. I was interpreting that question the other way. So yes, you can nest scopes in that way. And those scopes, you can either establish a pattern similar to this, where you say, I've got a data scope attribute, and I always want my scopes to be non-overlapping. So when you run into the next nested scope, stop there. You could create that sort of a pattern, or you can let scopes run into each other and overlap. So yes, they can be nested. The other way of interpreting that would be, can you actually nest the scope rules? And that's a little bit more confusing to think what that would be.
Yeah, then you get in the specificity issue again, and
yeah. So likely yes to your actual question, and no to the
second.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I also have a question, and that is, can you just have the end of the donut? Like you have like global styles, but that stops somewhere. Is that possible? Should be possible.
You would just do that by setting the root element as the scope. So
okay, all right.
Set HTML or the root pseudo class as the root of the scope.
Yeah, makes sense. Cool, thank you.
Sure.
And then in the chat, there's Josh once more. Josh, do you want to unmute yourself, maybe?
Yeah, I can do. So I was just wondering as well, like, were you looking at other syntaxes for this as well, like pseudo class, for example, as well?
Yeah, I think for some things, the at rule works better. Leah Veru is particularly interested in a pseudo class that does the just the donut part of it without the proximity impact. I don't think that we can get the proximity added as part of a pseudo class, as part of existing selectors. That would need to be done at a higher level. But the idea of a pseudo class that would do donut selection, that's being discussed. And then there's a question of, is that enough? Would we stop there? Would we still need something else? That's part of the open questions that make this still a little bit theoretical.
Thanks.
Okay, I also have a question regarding the beginning and the end of a scope. So what happens if, like, for my beginning and for the end, I set a certain class, and then in the DOM tree, I have beginning, end, and end as nested components. What would the scope apply to? Would it be like the inner components or the outer, or like first to first?
My sense is that we wouldn't try to do something clever there. I mean, some of these edge cases would get resolved in actually laying out the spec, so haven't necessarily been addressed yet. But my sense would be that we don't try to be clever. We just start at one of the root selectors and go till we hit the first lower boundary selector, and that's a scope. And then we start again at the second root selector and go to the first. So each of those would be scopes. They would probably be getting the same styles.
Okay, so the
but it would sort of
scope,
be,
the scope would apply twice to some of the components.
right.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting, thanks.
All right, so then the real reason probably most of us are here, container queries. Media queries allow us to respond to the viewport. I'm gonna open this up. So we can have these media elements that change from a vertical small layout to a horizontal large layout. But if we add a sidebar and we have one of them in the sidebar and one of them in the main area, suddenly that sort of single viewport size change no longer makes sense. So what we really want is some way of looking at the context that we're in, establishing containers and querying those containers instead of querying the viewport as a whole. So that's the goal of container queries initially. And this is a feature that's been discussed for years, a decade at least. And we want this to work no matter how those containers are nested. We want it to work anywhere on the page. We should be able to put this component anywhere and respond to the size that we have. But there's a little bit of a problem in CSS with measuring a container and then making changes to its children based on that measurement. We get a little bit of a paradox in our CSS. It's one of the coolest responsive features of CSS. Sorry, I can fix it. One of the coolest features of CSS is that we have this ability for boxes to respond to their contents. So really the problem here is that we've been a little too specific. And if we allow that box to respond to its contents, it will. And we even have various tools like min content or max content that will do special ways of using that information. Oh, that's because I have a hard line break there. So we have layout information going both directions in our HTML, in our CSS, from context in, and then also from content out. So if we are able to change one of those by measuring the other one, we can end up with a while loop. And that's why people thought this feature would be impossible for years. But over the last decade, people have been laying the groundwork to make it possible. So we now have a lot of the features in place that make this actually a viable idea. Last year, 2 main proposals emerged, and both showed different ways that we might pull this off. They're both really interesting if you want to look into them. Switch is getting combined with some other ideas. I don't think it's entirely gone, but may not do exactly the container queries thing. Container seems to be the one that has the most momentum. So that's the one that I picked up and have been specifying. So the first thing that we need to do to make this work is define containers. Any element on the page that we want to be able to measure and then respond to. And for those elements, we have to turn off content-based sizing. We have to cut that loop and say, okay, this element is going to be sized externally by its context. It's not going to be sized by its children. So we have a property for this now. It's called a contain, and it allows us to contain various types of things. And a lot of these containment types help with performance in various ways. They sort of isolate a section of the page and say, don't worry about laying this out until it's visible because it's contained. So that's what some sites have been using it for already. So size containment stops that child sizing. Layout containment sort of acts like a clear fix. Style containment stops mostly CSS counters from getting out. We're going to need all 3 of these to make it work, but there's a couple caveats here. 2D containment of size, containing size in both dimensions, that's too much. That's not going to work. We always need somewhere for our content to go. And if we're always containing both dimensions, we're going to run into this problem more and more. So we don't want that. So the first problem that we had to solve here was making inline size containment possible. We're also working on block size containment. We don't know if it's as possible. There's some complications in these 1D containments, but we want, in a lot of layouts already, we specify widths externally as part of the layout, and then we let height grow with the content. And so we want to make sure that that's possible with container queries as well. So we're adding contain inline size and then hopefully also contain block size, we'll see. And if inline size and block size both work, then we can add width and height as well. And the difference between inline size, block size, and width and height is whether it's responds to the writing mode of the document or whether it's just the physical dimensions, vertical or horizontal. So you don't need to memorize all of these values for contain because that's not a great syntax for this. We don't actually want to reuse that property. So we're creating a new property. There's a container type property where we just say the type of container that we want, and then the browser will figure out what containment is needed to provide that type of container. And that containment happens in the background. Warning, the names of these properties, some people want to bike shed them because container and contain are similar, or maybe this term is overused. So there may be some bike shedding of terms. These property names might change, but how they work is coming together pretty well. So once we have containers defined in our site, we can start to query them. And a container query looks the same as a media query, basically, but with @container instead of @media. And then the weird difference is that every element that is selected inside of that container query has to query its own container. They're not all in the same container. So every H2 on the page will have to look for its container and query it. So that's a thing to get your mind around. It doesn't apply the same to every element because every element has a different container, potentially. We can nest containers as much as we need to. It's also important that we're selecting the container is always outside of the card or the H2. You can't query yourself. If a container queried itself, that would cause the same sort of loop problems. So that's not possible either, but you can nest containers and you can have containers change in response to their containers. You can even turn containers on and off as containers depending on their context. So you can get quite complicated about it if you want to. And if you don't want to rely on the nearest container, we're adding container names. So you could have one or more names for a container. You could establish sort of naming conventions for how containers work. And then you can query only specific container names, or we're also trying to make it so you can make sure you're querying the right type of container. So you would say query the nearest inline size container and check that its width is greater than 30 ems. Another interesting thing here is that 30 ems in a container query should respond to the actual font size of the container, rather than with media queries, we're always querying against likely 16 pixels as an M, because that's the browser default font size. In this case, we're looking at an actual element, and we can measure the actual styles on that element, get the font size, and respond to its font size. So Chrome already has a prototype, and it's slowly been changing as we flesh out the spec and learn more about what it does and how it should work. I've started a CodePen collection of demos. So download Chrome Canary, go to Chrome Flags, search for CSS container queries and enable it. And once you restart the browser, all of those demos will start to work. But I will just show you a few demos here. So starting with my ugliest first demo that just shows off the difference between some media query sizing and then what happens when the container queries size based on their container instead. Here's a demo that shows the same block quote. This is a demo by David Heron. It's a single block quote repeated 3 times in different containers. Each container is set up. This is using the old syntax. We only recently added the new container syntax, so this demo still uses the old syntax. But you can see each of those containers is jumping first to horizontal and then to the purple fancy version, depending on the size of its own container. And all of that is done with a couple containers established on the page. Some media queries are doing the overall layout, and then a container query here that's changing to the different looks. In some cases, like working with Flexbox, you don't actually want to measure the container itself, because each element in a Flex layout or in a grid layout, you're in these Flex or grid tracks, and there's not an element there to measure. So this is a little bit of a workaround that's needed in order to measure something outside and not to measure the overall container, which would be a little wrong. We want to measure the actual size that each of these articles has. So I added a wrapper element around it, and the wrapper acts as the container, and then the card itself can reference that container. So we get, again here, I can change this to container type inline size, and it will still work because we've got the new syntax. And then these container queries are applying to the article, but referencing the .card container there. And that allows each of these elements to respond to its own sizing rather than the overall Flex layout. I think this will also be useful for people using web components. Actually, it looks like that's my next demo, so why not just jump to it? This is a demo by Max Bach, which I'm probably mispronouncing, but a little bookstore here. These are all web components with Shadow DOM, and you can use the host as your container and then do container queries inside of the host to have the contents of the container respond. So all of these books are using the same code, but when we drag them from one area to another, they end up in a different container size and respond to that size of that container. Without actually needing containment on the overall page layout parts, the containment is all sort of like a turtle carrying its shell with it, its home with it here. So I think those will sort of be the 2 types of containers that we see primarily. Some will be on layout elements, and then some components will want to carry their containment with them. Of course, we don't have to be practical about this. Jay Thompson created this blinds demo, where as we pull the container larger, the blinds open and Peter shows up. So you can have fun with containers, and particularly combining containers with the resize property allows you to do some fun things. He's done several of these demos. They're worth checking out. Stephanie Eccles the other day told me that my containers don't hold water, so I wanted to prove her wrong. I think she's here today. So take this. Here's my container with water. Well, not water there, absolutely water. Container, it holds water. Take that. Yeah, and there's more that we think container queries will be able to do here. We're still sort of working on the prototype and figuring out some of the details. It should be possible to do non-size queries. I think this might actually be one of the most powerful things that we get with container queries. This is a made-up syntax. I don't know what the syntax is going to look like, but we should be able to look at specific properties on the container and respond to them. I think that'll be particularly powerful with custom properties. So you could say, if the container has this custom property set in this way, say we can change an entire look of a card element or something, small, medium, large. We can do that all based on a simple toggle in a custom property. We might also be able to look at the state of a container. So say our header is position sticky and we want to know when it's stuck, we should be able to see that and respond to it. So again, I'm not sure what the syntax will look like, but this should be possible, and we're doing some tests on it. There's a polyfill that's coming soon, or the whole feature is probably coming soon. Chrome is working on it quite actively, hoping to release it by the end of the year. Firefox and Safari have both expressed interest, but don't really say their timelines. They're probably waiting for a stable spec, waiting for us to solve the problems. There's been a lot of work on the migration path here. So there is the polyfill, which you'll be able to use for older browsers with a little bit poorer performance because it's having to run in JavaScript. But then also you can use the @supports rule and check for container type or container name. We're also working on, it looks like I don't have links to them here. We're working on query units. So similar to VW and VH units that give you the viewport height and the viewport width. We're working on QW and QH, query height and query width, and query inline, query block, query min, and query max. Those units are part of the spec already. They're not in the prototype yet, but that's something that we're also working on. And I've got more resources here. All of this is changing quickly, but also coming soon. So feel free to check back these links and I'll try to keep them updated. And all of these features are designed to work together, building on those existing features of CSS and the cascade that holds it all together, but particularly the overlap between those two main goals that I talked about earlier, to make styles responsive and to make them reusable as objects. So building components that are inherently responsive, intrinsic, this idea of intrinsic web design. There's already been a lot of progress in this space. Grid and Flexbox give us a lot, aspect ratios, but now layer, scope, and container queries are also targeting that space, that overlap between responsiveness and components. To quote Jen Simmons, our medium is not done. Our medium is still going through radical changes.